Welcome to my channel, The Withered Fig Tree. My name is Randy Silva, and I've been doing podcasts on various Christian topics, and this current series is called The Dates of Christianity, and this is part 4. Let's go ahead and get started. Part 4 is called The Year of Jesus' Crucifixion and Resurrection. From last week, if we review, we talked about some parts of the Christmas story, namely the inn, the star of Bethlehem, and the Magi. And it turned out that inns did exist in the first century, but that it wasn't an inn. The word for inn wasn't used in that verse. It was the word for a guest room. And that's the Greek word kataluma. Likely what happened was there were other relatives of Joseph's family who had arrived in Bethlehem for the census, and they were in the kataluma, the guest room, so there was no room in that room. And so they were in the main room, what was called the family room. From part 2, we learned that it was a temperate month in which Jesus was born because the shepherds were out in the fields with the sheep, and they only stayed out in the fields when the temperature was warm. So we learned, given all the other information, that Jesus was born in September, which is one of the moderate months. Then we also learned that there was this part of the family room of this house, of the houses back then, that was actually part stable, and that the animals would stay in this lower part of the house, and that there were these sink-shaped recesses carved into the floor that they would put hay in, and those would be mangers. Now the animals then were not there because they were out in the fields, and that left the manger open, and so when Jesus was born, they put him in this manger that was in the house. Now regarding the other parts, the star and the inn, we learned about that the Magi may have been these Zoroastrians from Arabia or Persia, and that they had a prophecy that was possibly from the non-Israelite prophet Balaam, his prophecies are recorded in the book of Numbers. And those prophecies talk about a new star being a harbinger of a new king of the world. Today in part 4, we're going to move on from Christmas time. We're going to switch to Easter. I know Easter is a few months off, but now you'll be prepared for Easter come that time. Now, as this series is devoted to the dates and times of Christianity, today I want to talk about the year that Jesus was crucified. In the first part of this series, we talked about the year of his birth and how there's a lot of uncertainty in that. In this part, we're going to talk about the year of his death. Originally, I was also going to talk about the day of week that Jesus was crucified, but I found so much information on the year that Jesus was crucified, I decided to do this in a different part. This looks like this will be a 5-part series, and next week we'll talk about the day of the week on which Jesus was crucified. Let's talk about the year that Jesus was crucified on, and typically you would do that relative to the year of his birth. So let's try that to begin with. So from part 1, we know that the range of years in which Jesus was born had to be at a minimum 8 BC and at a maximum 6 AD. Now from Luke 3:23, we know that Jesus started his ministry when he was about 30 years old. So if we give that about 30, it's not an exact number. It'd be nice if Luke had said when Jesus was precisely 30 years old, he started his ministry. But he didn't say that. He just said about 30. So if we give that a plus or minus 1 year uncertainty, meaning that he was older than 29, but he was still 30, so he was less than 31, when he started his ministry. That seems reasonable. Then examining the chronology of events and holidays mentioned in the four Gospels, theologians have computed the length of Jesus' ministry to 3.5 years. They do that in several different ways, looking at different information from the four Gospels. But one way of doing it is just to look in the Gospel of John. In the Gospel of John, Jesus starts his ministry in chapter 1, verse 35 at his baptism from John the Baptist. And then in chapter 2, verse 13, you see the Gospel of John records the first Passover that Jesus observed after he started his ministry. And then in chapter 5, verse 1, there was some sort of a Passover. It was a festival, it says, and there's several different holidays that could be interpreted as a festival, like the Passover or Rosh Hashanah, or the Festival of Booths. Anyway, it was one of those. So that in chapter 5, verse 1 shows another year going by. And then it talks about another Passover in chapter 6, verse 4. And then, of course, we know that Jesus was crucified on a Passover. You can see that in several places, but one place is in chapter 19, verse 31. So if you add that all together, it was at least 3 years that Jesus had his ministry, and he started before that Passover, so it was likely more than 3 years. So that's where you get this 3 to 3.5 year range. Now, if you combine that with this range of 8 BC to 6 AD, then you would get his death so you combine that with the uncertainty in when he started his ministry, and the uncertainty of the length of his ministry, and the uncertainty of his birth year, and you get a range of 23 AD to 40 AD. And that's a very large range. And hopefully we can try to narrow it in, hone it down to a shorter length. Now, how can we do that? So that brings me to what we'll spend the most time in this podcast live stream talking about. What if we could date the year of Jesus' death and resurrection based on another date, a more absolute and more precisely known date? And the date that I'm going to use is the destruction of the temple in 70 AD, as my dogs start to go crazy. If we could work backwards from another date, like this date of the destruction of the temple, then we could date Jesus' death that way, rather than relative to his birth, which has this large uncertainty. Now, the dates of the destruction of the temple are very well known, very established. It was a horrific day for the Jews, and I guess you'd call it a victorious day for the Romans, and so they both talked about it in their historical records, and it's well known that the temple fire was started on the 9th of Av, that's the month in the Jewish calendar, and was burned down completely by the 10th. So it was, I guess you'd call it like a 24-hour fire. And we know that that was in August of 70 AD. It was either August 4th or August 30th, depending on whether the prior year had been a leap year with an additional month or not. So there is in the Julian or Gregorian calendar, there's two different dates it could be on. But nevertheless, it was for sure in August, and it was definitely on the 9th and 10th of Av. If there were some way to gauge or measure how long before the destruction of the temple that Jesus was crucified, then we could use that to date his death, independently from his birth, when he started his ministry, and the length of his ministry. And there is a way. And it's actually a very, very interesting way, which is why I want to spend a whole half an hour on it rather than just 15 minutes. And it comes from the Jewish Babylonian Talmud. They call the different books tractates. And so the tractate in the Talmud that this comes from is called Yoma. And that book is dedicated to Yom Kippur, which is the holiday or the celebration of the Day of Atonement. And on page 39b of that book, it says this is the text of it. This is a quote from it. The sages taught during the tenure of Shimon HaZaddik, the lot for God always arose in the high priest's right hand. After his death, it occurred only occasionally. But during the 40 years prior to the destruction of the Second Temple, the lot for God did not arise in the high priest's right hand at all. So too the strip of crimson wool that was tied to the head of the goat that was sent to Azazel did not turn white. And the westernmost lamp of the menorah did not burn continually. So here in this tractate of Yoma, page 39, it records some very strange happenings at the temple that were noted by Jewish historians, by the rabbis and the high priests. And it's kind of confusing to read this, but let me give some details to this, and hopefully it'll become clearer what this passage is talking about. And what it's talking about is actually very amazing. And it says a lot about Christianity and about the power of God. I'm kind of surprised that more Christians aren't aware of it, in fact, that it's not taught more broadly about these miracles that happened at the temple that were seen as omens to the Jews, but as signs of Christ's divinity and his birth and death for Christians. Let's break this down, what this paragraph talks about. So for 40 years, prior to the destruction of the temple in 70 AD, on Yom Kippur, the Day of Atonement, this strange thing happened. What's called the lot for God, which is a white-colored token. Sometimes they think it's a coin, or maybe it was like a little cube or something. I don't know. Whatever it is, it's a token, and it was white. And this white color they used was a symbol of purity. And this token, the white token, whichever goat it fell to, that was the goat that was to be sacrificed on Yom Kippur. So the high priest would reach into this box, and there'd be two tokens. I'm sure they'd shake it up and randomize it, like dice. And in this box were two tokens, a black one and a white one. The white one was called the lot for God, and the black one was called the lot for Azazel. Not quite sure what Azazel means, but we can look that up. Maybe I'll talk about it in the review next week. Nevertheless, the lot for Azazel was black and the lot for God was white. He would reach his hand into this box, and the goat would be there'd be one goat on his left and one goat on his right. And when he opened his hands, whichever hand held the white token, the goat on that side would be sacrificed, and the goat on the other side would be released into the wilderness with a red crimson scarf tied to its neck. And that goat was called the scapegoat, which is where we get our terminology, our word for scapegoat. And this was on Yom Kippur, which is in September. We know that the temple was destroyed in 70 AD, so it was a month before the Yom Kippur of 70 AD. So then, if we know there was 40 of these Yom Kippurs before August of 70 AD, we can go all the way back to 30 AD. So in the Yom Kippur in September of 30 AD, all the way to the Yom Kippur in 69 AD, when the high priest would reach his hands into the box, the white token was always in his left hand, and the black token was always in his right hand. And that's pretty amazing if you think about it. Now, it also talks about this scarf. It says, the strip of crimson wool that was tied to the head of the goat that was sent to Azazel did not turn white. Okay, so it was expected by the Jews that this scarf would turn white. And they would actually have somebody follow this goat into the wilderness to ensure that the scarf turned white. That would be either because the Jews probably would think that it's supernatural, and maybe it was supernatural that the scarf is turning white, but obviously out in the elements, being sun bleached and with rain and time and wind and so forth, it would turn white. There was a good chance that it would turn white, and it always did turn white. And that was a sign that the transgressions of the Jewish people from the prior year had been forgiven by God. Because again, this white is purity, and this crimson color represented the blood of sacrifice of the other goat that had been sacrificed. And so you can see how all this symbolism plays out. So that's pretty amazing. So the Talmud doesn't explicitly state how often the lot for God, the white token, came up in the priest's right hand, but the text implies that it most often did. So you think about just probabilities. There's a white token and a black token. You'd think that 50-50, the white token would appear in his right hand. And what the text is saying is that that's actually not the case. It was higher than 50%. It was much higher than 50%. It wasn't 100%, but it was a high percentage of the time that the white token would appear in his right hand, and that was considered a good omen. Now, if you think about the odds that the black token would randomly appear in the priest's right hand in the 40 years preceding the destruction of the temple in 70 AD, the probability of that are astronomically low. It's 1 in a trillion. And the reason why this black token appearing in the right hand of the priest was considered ominous is because of the many, many times in the Bible that the right hand is lifted up above the left hand. So if you look in like Exodus 15:6, it says, "Your right hand, Lord, was majestic in power. Your right hand, Lord, shattered the enemy." In Psalm 16:11, that ends with eternal pleasures at your right hand. And in Psalm 110, verse 1, which is quoted in Acts chapter 2, it says, "The Lord says to my Lord, sit at my right hand until I make your enemies a footstool for your feet." So imagine how ominous it would have appeared. So even if it just in 1 year, the priest opened his right hand and it was the black token, everybody would be like, oh, bummer. Maybe that means something bad that year. Imagine that happening for 40 years in a row. They'd be like, oh my gosh, the sky is falling. Even after like probably 10 years, they would know something really bad is happening. You can just imagine the high priest like closing his eyes and, seeing this black token in his right hand. Now, additionally, the number 40 had a symbolic meaning of judgment and transformation. And if you think about some passages or some events in the Bible, like the flood, it rained for 40 days and 40 nights. If you look at Moses, he spent 40 days and 40 nights on Mount Sinai, and he actually did that twice, fasting for the whole time, and then at the end of the 40-day period, receiving the law of God, the law from God. Some other times, the spies explored the land of Canaan for 40 days, and then most notably, the Jews wandered in the desert for 40 years. And I found at least 10 other references in the Old Testament to 40 days. Things like the lengths of Saul and David and Solomon's reigns. And there was also something about Elijah the prophet, and just all kinds of 40-year periods, or 40-day periods, I should say. Well, one of them was 40 years. So therefore, the Jews would have known that the period of these omens was precisely 40 years and not some other number, not about 40. They would have been counting this, very precisely. And when the temple was destroyed, they would have been like, I knew it. I knew it was after that 40th one. I knew something bad was going to happen. So that would mean that for sure, that the first ominous event on Yom Kippur would have occurred in 30 AD. Now, although there's no direct Jewish text connecting this 40-year period of these ominous signs in the temple with Christ, several early Christian writers did. Some examples of that is Eusebius and Tertullian. The Jews only connected it to God being against them for some reason. If you look at this from this Christian point of view, like the Christian writers Eusebius and Tertullian, this is great, I guess you'd call it spiritual evidence, these omens at the temple, that Jesus was crucified on the Passover of 30 AD. And that's pretty amazing. So we're using this number of 40 years in a row, and I guess we're making the assumption that God would start that on the year of Jesus' death, and the Passover in March, late March or early April, and then Yom Kippur being later in that year in September or early October. Then, assuming he started it then, that first year, then it would have been 30 AD that Jesus was crucified. So independently, not using his birth, just using these spiritual omens from God at the temple that were taken note of by the Jews, we can determine or calculate the year that Jesus was crucified as Passover of 30 AD. We could then work backward from there. In part one, we tried to come up with dates for the birth of Jesus based on the text from like Luke, when he said in the 15th year of Tiberius, when he was about 30, and also this idea that there was a census and that Herod was still alive, and that's when we came up with this large range of 8 BC to 6 AD. But now that we have this important date, we have his date of his death as 30 AD, we can work backwards from there to find out, or more precisely pin down the year of his birth. So, depending on the length of his ministry, and again, as I mentioned early on, it was 3 to 3.5 years. And depending on the age that he started his ministry, which we've given a 1 year, plus or minus 1 year uncertainty, so 29 to less than 31 years old, then his age at crucifixion would be 32 to 33.5 years old. But if we look at the second part of this series, we know that he was born in September and crucified in March. So if he was born in September and crucified in March, that would mean that in March he would have been half a year of some number of years of age. He would have been like 33.5 or 32.5. We put that together, then we had this range of 32 to 33.5. Well, that means it actually he has to have been 32.5 or 33.5 when he was crucified. And that would put his birth at the September of 5 BC or 4 BC. So just two different dates, not a range of 1 year, but two different dates, late September of 5 BC or 4 BC. So that's pretty amazing. I thought it was pretty amazing. I thought it was very interesting how God worked these symbols out. And if you think from a Christian New Testament, New Covenant perspective, what God was symbolizing or trying to communicate to the Jews, we know that when Jesus died, there was an earthquake, that the sky turned dark, and that the curtain of the temple was torn into from top to bottom. This really long, thick curtain behind which was the Ark of the Covenant. So those were all should have been treated as signs like, oh man, we just messed up. We killed the Son of God. Just like Pharaoh, though, who didn't perceive the 10 plagues as true indicators that Moses was talking to God and that he should let the Jewish people go. The Jews seem to have the same kind of bewilderment or the confusion, whatever it was. They were unable to make that connection, and so they weren't able to make the connection at Jesus' death. But they were also, for the 40 years after Jesus' death, God was doing these things like the black lot always turning up in the right hand, the scarf never turning white. That means that their sins are no longer forgiven by the ritual of Yom Kippur. That's because Jesus died and he was the final sacrifice. He was the final perfect sacrifice. So the other things were the what was it? The menorah, the Western menorah. It was supposed to be left burning, and the high priest would make sure that it was always burning. And that's also what happened during Hanukkah, that they only had enough oil to keep it burning for 1 day, but it burned for 8 days. So that was a miracle. Well, during this 40-year period, it kept on blowing out. And also the eastern door kept on opening, which is symbolic, again, that God is not there. And so you kind of would think the Jews would connect this with Jesus, but unfortunately, most of them did not. But God was definitely trying to communicate it. And then the destruction of the temple in 70 AD was definitely, that should have been interpreted as the end of sacrifice. And hopefully you would think that more Jews would have known now that Jesus was the Messiah. But again, most of them did not even connect that. They were just very, very sad. And they still celebrate that. Well, celebrate is not the right word, but they still remember that day till today, the destruction of the temple that happened in 70 AD. All right. So next week, as I mentioned, we'll talk about the day of the week that Jesus was crucified. Of course, traditionally, this is Friday, but what if it was some other day? Would that make things better or worse, or would it fulfill prophecy better? That's the kind of things that we'll be talking about. Thanks again for joining me today, and remember to like and subscribe to my channel, The Withered Fig Tree, and have a great evening.